Hey there, everybody. Steve the Amateur Historian coming to you as knee-deep in quarantine as I think is humanly possible. I'm in the movie room downstairs, wall to wall, there's no windows. Uh, it's about as quarantine as you can get. And during my time in quarantine, I've decided to do a series of videos. Now, I'm not really doing them as a series, it's just a series of videos that kind of the subject matter is comparable. I've gotten really into researching primarily local, like Oregon-based missing persons cases, unsolved murders, Jane and John Doe cases, essentially mysterious deaths of people, which, you know, pretty much every time it's a murder of some kind. Some cases are people who have been murdered and we have no clue who did it, how it happened. We have we have murder cases where people's bodies were never recovered. We have murder cases where people were killed and we don't know exactly who did it, but we're pretty sure we know who did it, but it still can't be 100% verified. Again, Jane and John Doe cases where we don't even know the identity of the victim. The series is going to kind of run the gamut. I've been doing a lot of research recently into an assortment of cases, and I wanted to start off with one that is it's a case from the 1970s, and it's one of those cases where someone just up and disappeared out of nowhere. They were just suddenly gone forever, never to be seen again. This is a case of somebody whose body has never to this day been recovered, almost 50 years later. There's no idea what led to the disappearance of this individual. It is literally a case where we have no crime scene, no valid theory, whether it was a runaway, an abduction, we don't have a suspect, we have nothing, just a person who something obviously happened to her. We just don't know what. And I am going to discuss that and also pose, just for consideration, I don't know if I necessarily believe this to be the case, but when you have something like this where someone disappears and you have practically nothing to go on, you kind of have to start just considering the possibilities of, what else strange and potentially murderous was going on around that time in generally the area where a certain case might have happened. And alas, because these were a lot of Oregon cases, and most of these cases are predominantly between like 1960 and the early 1980s. So of course, pretty much all these cases where someone died, or it was a female that died and they were young and it's a mystery who unsolved it or who committed these crimes. Pretty much every one of those types of cases, you're going to be hearing names like Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway periodically throughout the series, because there's certain victims in these cases that people theorize whether one of these guys or other people of that heightened reputation as a twisted killer might have been involved, because both Ted Bundy and Gary Ridgway operated out of Washington, at least Ted Bundy initially, and they're both known to have killed people who lived in Oregon as well, at least a couple. So I'm going to discuss that as well in relation to this case. And all that said, let's get started. So this first case I'm going to be discussing, I also want to make mention here real quick that I have two videos that I've never posted that I forgot I'd even done, that I did about 1.5 years ago that fit in with these series. They're both videos about crimes that were committed where we don't know for 100% certain who is responsible, but we're pretty sure we know who the guilty parties are. So I'm also going to post those videos. One is a video about two girls who disappeared from like kind of the Salem-Corvallis area, I believe in the late 70s. Anne Ellenwood and Stephanie Ann Newsom, where these two girls that disappeared within a couple of days of each other back in the 70s. And then I do a video on the 1977 attempted axe killing of two women that were traveling across country together, and they stayed at a campground in Central Oregon, and this guy came flying towards them with his car, and he had an axe with him, and it was this crazy story. So those are two videos I actually did about a year and a half ago that I'm going to post intermittently in this series with these other videos because it fits the context. So you'll be seeing those videos as well. That said, I'm going to get into the first case, which this is the 1973 disappearance of a woman named Rita Lorraine Jolly. Now, her last name is spelled Jolly, Jolly. Maybe her last name was pronounced Holly, but logistically I'm going with Jolly. So Rita Jolly would have been her name. And she lived actually right across the Willamette River, pretty much from where I used to live. She lived in West Linn, which is located a little south of Portland and on the west side of the Willamette River, which is the river that, kind of cuts through Portland. And she lived up in the kind of West Linn's kind of like you got the river here, and then you got kind of the lowlands, and then the further west you get to the river, you kind of start going up into the hills, and that is where Rita lived, was kind of up in the hills of West Linn. It's very bougie today. I mean, I'm sure it was nice in the 70s, but I don't really know how bougie West Linn was in the 70s compared to how it's been, at least as long as I can remember. And the date in particular was June 29th, 1973. That is the last time that she was seen alive. She left her home on Horton Road, and she apparently just wanted to go for a walk, which I can identify with very well, especially now in quarantine. I can't do my walks that I like to do. I have to just walk circles in the backyard during our quarantine. So she just decided to leave and just take a nice little evening walk. She left around 7 to 7:15 p.m. from her home, and she never made it back. There was at least one report seeing her in kind of the Cedar Oak area, which I know that area because my cousin grew up there, and I used to go over to his house there. So there was one report of seeing her there, but it seems like there was, by all accounts, she had traveled kind of south of where her home was, and she was last seen definitively walking along Sunset Avenue, which again is the southern part of West Linn. She was just seen walking, and after that, nobody knows what happened to her. She vanished, and she has not been seen since, 47 years later. Nobody knows what happens. Nobody saw, she was just a girl walking down the street. People wouldn't have reason to pay close attention to her, aside from whoever might want to abduct her. But, no reports of any strange vehicles following her, strange people walking up to her, a vehicle pulling to the side of the road, conversing with her, any screams for help, anything. There was nothing. Nobody knows where, how, or why she disappeared. But considering the fact that she was a 17-year-old girl who'd gone out for a walk in the evening, she may have been potentially a, victim of opportunity for somebody. I think, it doesn't seem, now again, there's not really a lot of information on this case, but it does seem that she led a pretty okay life. It didn't seem like she had a reason to run away. I didn't find any information that suggested she was a runaway. And with missing persons cases like this, especially teenagers, they always provide information about whether this person is a chronic runaway. Rita Jolly didn't seem to fit into that dynamic. So it seems very likely, although we have nothing to go on, it seems very likely that she was probably deceased at this point, but it seems very likely she was probably abducted by someone. Now, who is that person? Where did that happen? Where was she taken to? Again, we have no idea. We can only theorize and speculate, and that theorization and speculation is based on practically nothing. Some lunatic in that part of West Linn, or someone who lived in the Portland area who just liked to drive around and menace people, could have grabbed her off the street. Maybe she went down another side street that was a lot more, because Sunset Avenue's a pretty open road. It'd be very risky to abduct somebody off that stretch. I've been on it before. I know the area. And she could have gone down a more desolate side street. Someone could have grabbed her, ran off with her. A small part of me likes to theorize. There's a house in West Linn. I don't know if it's still up. It had been boarded up for years. It's very sketchy totally out of place for West Linn, because again, West Linn is fairly bougie, and there was this just gross, weird, beat-up house. And I saw it, and I went up to it once when I was just exploring, like, oh, abandoned house. And I just got a very weird vibe from it. I got a very strange, like, I think there's dead bodies in here vibe. But then again, I always get those vibes with random sketchy places like that. There was kind of a musty smell coming out of it, but then again, it was boarded up, so it could have been just mold had overtaken the interior. But I did a video about this once. I had a dream about that house where I walked into it. I was actually able to get inside. And there was like a big trash bag on the floor that clearly had like human remains in it. And as I noticed it, this this ringing kind of started and like built to where it was like this clamoring in my ears, and it just made me freak. And I ran to the door, and of course the door's locked, and I can't get out now. And just this ringing in my ears and dead body, and then I just like lurched out of bed, just like, heart pounding. Like it shook me up. And it was a dream I had about that house. And this house was kind of right down the hill from where Rita Jolly lived. And a little bit north, it would have been a little bit kind of northeast of where she was last seen alive. But apparently, I found a little information about the house, and apparently it had been vacant for a long time, and whoever lived in there was a little sketchy, and a small part of me wonders, like, was she taken there and murdered? Like, I mean, is it likely that happened? No, but that's kind of the direction my mind wants to wander in, this house that was probably about, half a mile up the street from where she was last seen, and as this house has been boarded up forever, and these weird vibes. And anyway, I find myself thinking of that. She could have just been nabbed by a local, or, some crazy creepers, serial killers, they drive around obsessively because they're looking for that next victim, and someone could have seen her. And here's the thing about Rita Jolly, because you think, what would make her, like, obviously she was young, she was a young woman, and that is a big target for a lot of crazed killers. She had fractured a leg. One of her legs was had fractured, and it didn't heal properly, and so she walked with a little bit of a lumber. Like, she couldn't walk, just perfectly normal. She limped a little bit. So I could see, someone driving around looking for their next victim or whatever, and they see Rita Jolly, who was a young female, which is a common target victim, and they could have noticed that she was limping. That's a person's going to see that and think that's a potential victim of opportunity right there. This is somebody who maybe can't even run away from me. So that could have been a potential reason why she might have been targeted as a victim, was someone could have seen her kind of lumbering. And I think she walked fine. I mean, obviously, she was going out for a walk. It wasn't like she was, bedridden. She didn't need crutches. But someone could have seen that and thought, oh, here's somebody who probably can't run away. And that might have instigated somebody to act. We don't know. And of course, the name Ted Bundy came up in this case. Now, Ted Bundy, again, this happened end of June 1973. Now, officially, as we know, definitive kills for Ted Bundy. His first victim was in early 1974, and that was a woman. Healy was her. I'm sorry, I had to pull up my notes. Linda Ann Healy, who he killed reportedly on February 1st, 1974. So this is about 7 months or so after Rita Jolly disappeared. And of course, a lot of Ted Bundy's early kills were in Washington, in the Seattle area. And then there was a couple victims at the lake that he did. And there's only one confirmed woman who was an OSU student that he is known to have killed. So he officially didn't seem to go on this, crazed killing spree till 1974, and he mostly killed up in, a couple hundred miles north of where Rita Jolly went missing. That being said, Ted Bundy is known to have said after he was in prison that he killed as far back as 1972. And it is known that Ted Bundy is one of those guys that like to drive around a lot looking for victims. So, he may have potentially already been killing by the middle of 1973 when this case happened. He may have been driving around, which would have led him to places like Oregon, Idaho, California, who knows. But all that said, I think it was a young woman. Rita Jolly did kind of have, everybody talks about how Ted Bundy targeted women with dark hair, kind of how I am right now. Dark hair parted down the middle. And that was kind of how Rita Jolly looks. Rita Jolly kind of had that Bundy victim look to her. But all that said, considering the time and place, and the odds of Ted Bundy randomly having one of few excursions down to the Portland area and just stumbling onto Rita Jolly in West Linn while she was out on a walk, the odds of that are so extensively huge. I think there's probably a 1 in 500 million chance that Ted Bundy actually killed her. It's just, it's the 70s, and it's a young woman, and so you want to, Ted Bundy's a convenient first place you go to. And there were other, like there was the skull of a woman that was found up on Mount Hood as late as 1986. But when they found the skull, they said that this individual may have been dead in that area, or had been dead for over a decade. And you think it's about 13 years after Rita Jolly goes missing. So some people contemplate, when you find the head of someone, the first thing you start doing is you start looking into who are all the missing women missing people that might fit the dynamic of what this skull could belong to. But I've seen pictures of like a reconstruction, and it looks like the woman reportedly had red hair, like bright red hair, which Lorraine Jolly had dark hair. I keep calling her Lorraine. That's her middle name. Rita Jolly had dark hair, so she wouldn't have been that victim, and it's unlikely that far down the road that it would have been here. However, there's another individual whose identity is known now. This is where I'm kind of getting off into another possible suspect in a case where we don't even know what happened. And this is another case that for a while people thought Ted Bundy was responsible for, because this victim went missing in September of 1974, and by that point Ted Bundy was neck deep in doing what he did. But it would have been, I believe, in October 1974, the remains of 2 women were found. It was called like Dole Valley. I think it was kind of like rural Clark County, north of Vancouver, Washington, so a ways north of the Portland area. They found the remains of 2 women that were a little ways apart, but were kind of in the same general area. One woman was identified as a Carol Valenzuela, and I believe she was identified, I want to say she was identified using dental records. But there was another set of remains that was found there that they deemed had been dead for at least a couple of weeks that they couldn't identify. And I think what complicated matters for them was they thought this woman was, they said she was, probably in her mid-20s. Some people said about 20 to 25 years old, and she was actually only 17. So I think that kind of put in people's mind they were looking for someone, or if they were looking for any missing person, they weren't really looking at teenagers. They were looking at people in their 20s. And people, because the victim was, decomposing at that point, but it had only been a couple of weeks. So it was still, it wasn't bones. It wasn't just a skeleton. And the woman had pretty thick dark hair, which Rita Jolly had, and for a while. And again, the victim would ultimately be identified as being a 17-year-old, which Rita was as well. So she was right about the right age. And so some people contemplated whether these remains that had been recovered might have been Rita Jolly's remains. But by 2015, they were finally identified as belonging to a Martha Morrison, she was another missing person who, like Lorraine Jolly, she just vanished in the early 1970s, and nobody knew what happened. And finally, in 2015, they were able to at least put to rest what had happened to her, where she ended up, and these remains were identified as her. And the two didn't really look a lot like each other, but they had similar characteristics in terms of the hair and whatnot. And Yeah, Martha Morrison, it was one of those seemingly really, really tragic, unfortunate cases that she was someone that grew up she had a really tough upbringing. She apparently grew up in a very rough home. She mostly grew up in Eugene. She was a frequent run. Ugh, I can't talk. She was a frequent runaway. So of course, when she went missing, a lot of people probably thought she was just running away. And by the time she was 17, she was sharing an apartment with a mysterious man that it seems like nobody. I don't even know if the identity of the man has actually come out. And she took this man to visit relatives, and I guess they never got his name because I've never seen a name attributed to this guy. But she was just living with this mysterious man. So of course, when she turns up dead a while later, he's the guy that attention gets focused on. And they were sharing a place, and I believe they were probably living in the St. John's area because it says that she was going to Roosevelt High School, and Roosevelt High School is right smack in the middle of St. John's, the St. John's area of Portland. That's essentially the St. John's School of that area. So I'm guessing she lived more or less in that area. And yeah, there a lot of theorization about who it was. I even read somewhere that somebody thought it might have been Patty Hearst because she was still missing at that time. And again, they thought it was somebody who was more in their 20s. But yeah, Martha Morrison. They said when they found the body, they thought that she may have actually given birth at one time, and there's no verification as to whether Martha Morrison was ever pregnant, ever had kids. But there was like little things like that popped up. And I don't think the remains were really being considered to have been Martha Morrison. Actually, in terms of her being missing, that was kind of it wasn't just people looking for victims in the Oregon, Washington area, but even there was a woman that turned up dead in 1979 in Texas, who, by my notes, it says that she's known as Orange Socks. So I think that was just an identifying. I'm assuming the victim was found with orange socks on, but a Jane Doe case, someone who hadn't been identified. And another name that might pop up from time to time in this series, because he's taking credit for every murder that's ever happened to any woman, is a guy named Henry Lee Lucas, who one of these guys that he's one of those people that has always wanted to be known as this guy that killed so many victims, and yet it's only verified that he's killed at least a couple women. But I think there's like some people have said there's like 300 different women that this guy is taking credit for. And he traveled around a lot with a guy named Otis Toole, who kind of did the same thing. He would take credit for a lot of murders that he didn't have the details on, or anything he knew about. Anything either of these guys knew about the crime, it was stuff you could find in newspapers, and it would be verified later on that they weren't involved. And Henry Lee Lucas ultimately said he committed that murder of this woman, and apparently the individual, this woman that was killed, did look a lot like Martha Morrison. So there were the occasional efforts to try to find her, but then when these remains were found, again, just a couple weeks after she had disappeared. I think she disappeared start of September of 1974, and then by October, these remains are found. Maybe there was some contemplation that maybe these were her remains, but it didn't seem like anybody was seriously considering it, because it was big news in 2015 when it was finally verified that those were her remains. But beyond the fact that she was identified, because we now knew who the victim was, family members donated DNA so that, because now her remains are found. They didn't know who the killer was, but now if they found a potential suspect, they could compare DNA. And a couple years later, there was a very sketchy character who killed multiple women by the name of William Leslie Forrest. And by 2017, there was I believe a pistol that he owned that had blood on it, and that blood was tested against this DNA that was provided, and it matched Martha Morrison's DNA. So that vindicated that William Forrest was Martha Morrison's killer. And this is a guy that he had this, he was a serial killer. He killed at least they say as many as 6 women. And he used kind of the classic approach that a lot of people did. This was something that Edmund Kemper did a lot, because he'd pick up co-eds who were hitchhiking and take them places and, kill some of them, unfortunately, along the way. William Forrest, during the early 70s, at the time, both Rita Jolly went missing and Martha Morrison did. He worked for the Parks and Recreations Department in Clark County, where, Vancouver, Washington is, so southern Washington. And he had a blue van that he drove around, and he picked up women that were hitchhikers. A lot of his victims were women who the last time they were seen, they were hitchhiking. And I think in at least one or two cases, these women were seen getting into someone's blue van. So this guy would get these women into his van. He had control of them at that point, and then he would kill them. And for the most part, these women would be discovered in kind of rural areas north of Vancouver. And I know during this time, Forrest lived in Battleground, which is a little ways north of Vancouver, and again, Martha Morrison and Carol Valenzuela, who were both found close to each other, they were found, out in the woods, and there was one particular victim that he assaulted who survived, and he tied her to a tree and left her there out in the middle of nowhere, and she managed to survive. But even that victim, he took her out to the middle of nowhere, so that seemed to be kind of his MO. Pick up hitchhikers, take them where he wanted, do what he wanted with them, and then didn't seem like he really buried the victims that often. I think he thought these places were rural enough that he could just leave the remains there and animals would make off with them, but people would never really find them. And yeah, he was considered a suspect. He was convicted of killing, looking down the list, or he's known to have killed a Barbara Ann Deary, who was 18 and disappeared in 1972, last seen hitchhiking along Highway 14, which Highway 14 runs along the Columbia River, Washington side of the river, across the river from Portland and Oregon and all that. And then there was a Krista Blake, who was 19, who also lived in Vancouver. She vanished July 11th, 1974, so this is after Rita Jolly, before Martha Morrison. And she was one of the victims that was actually seen getting into a blue van, so that really vindicates things well. And then, of course, there's Carol Valenzuela, who was, it was believed that she was hitchhiking, and she lived in Camas, which was or at least she was in Camas, which is just east of Vancouver. But there were also victims, there was at least two other victims that he was thought to have been involved in their death, and one that he has been tied to but never officially convicted on or had it added to his conviction, like Martha Morrison, was a young girl named Jamie Grissom, who was another girl from the kind of Vancouver area who vanished, and her body's never been found. Nobody knows exactly what happened. However, her student ID was found like a short distance away from where Martha Morrison and Carol Valenzuela's bodies were found. So circumstantial evidence, yeah, but does that kind of pretty much show that, Forrest killed Jamie Grissom too? I think so. What are the odds in that vast nowhere that suddenly this missing girl's ID shows up next to the remains, that both these people were killed by this specific guy? So, was William Forrest guilty of their murders too? I think so. And that being said, I wonder, and there are reasons to question this or to say that this is unlikely. I wonder if William Forrest, because some of the girls he abducted looked like Rita Jolly. Rita Jolly was, a lot of the people that William Forrest abducted were women in their late teens. Rita Jolly was 17 years old. She was right there. And I wonder if potentially William Forrest was not responsible for Rita Jolly's death, because right at the time this happened, he was abducting women the same age. He was abducting and murdering them and depositing their bodies in rural locations where, granted, some have been found, but it's less likely to be found. And that could explain why, one of the reasons we probably don't know what happened to Rita Jolly is if she was abducted and killed, or whatever the circumstances were, she could have been deposited or buried somewhere extremely rural that people don't go to and has never been found. Because of that, so I wonder It's right at the right time. I think William Forrest is a much more likely suspect than Ted Bundy. Now there are, reasons to question this. The primary one is location. William Forrest, all of his known victims, for the most part, and even suspected victims, were people who lived around Vancouver, Washington. It didn't seem like he really crossed even into Oregon. And once you cross into Oregon, you got to go another 15, 20 miles south to get to West Linn. You had to go all the way through Portland to get to West Linn. So it was a little bit out of this guy's range, but I don't think that definitively proves that it couldn't have been him. Some killers, if they're abducting people in the same location, they might move over a little bit and start taking victims from a different area. That's happened with serial killers. Some will start just in the town they live in, and then they kind of spread out a little bit. And who knows how many other missing people from the early 70s that this guy may have killed that we don't even know. We haven't even ascribed to the guy. So location is difficult. West Linn is a little bit out of William Forrest's way, but only 20 miles. This isn't like, a guy kills a bunch of people in Seattle and you're trying to say that he also killed this one random person in Boise, Idaho. Because I think that's the only thing that really calls into question William Forrest as a possible suspect. Because everything else about Rita Jolly and what little we know about what happened to her fits. She wouldn't have necessarily been hitchhiking, but she would have been walking down the street and he could have seen her again with her bad leg and thought, this is an easy victim. Or he could have pulled up and said, hey, your leg's tired? Hey, I can give you a ride home. And then he gets her in his van and then he's got her. And he could have taken her north like everyone else. And even Martha Morrison. Granted, she lived in the St. John's area, which is right across the river from Vancouver into Portland. But, who knows? Martha Morrison could have ran away. She could have fled up into Vancouver, and that's where she encountered Forrest. But the fact of the matter is, again, we don't know exactly when she specifically was abducted or disappeared with this guy. But Martha Morrison wasn't from Vancouver. She lived in the St. John's area, where even if you cross into Oregon, the closest you can get to St. John's by crossing from Washington to Oregon is crossing on the interstate bridge. And even then, you got to go several miles west just to get up to St. John's. It's a little bit, as a killer who is mainly working out of the Vancouver, Washington area, it's a little bit of an inconvenience to get to the St. John's area. And who's to say that's not where Martha Morrison disappeared from? And she was originally from Eugene. Who's to say she wasn't traveling south when she encountered him? So Martha Morrison is potentially a break in that norm that he was targeting women in specifically the Vancouver area who specifically were hitchhiking. We don't know. Maybe Martha Morrison was hitchhiking. We don't know the details of how she died, unfortunately. But she was somebody who was living in Portland and ended up being one of his victims. So, who's to say he didn't at some point go a little bit further south and pick up Rita Jolly? Who's to say there might not be a couple other people in the the general Portland metropolitan area who disappeared during the early 70s. There were young women who may or may not also be victims of this guy. So I'm not saying definitively that this guy is the killer, but I'm just saying, or, we don't even know for certain that she's dead, but I think, considering the circumstances, I think she was probably dead within a couple hours to a couple of days after she disappeared. It's what makes it so frightening. Rita Jolly just decided to go for a walk, and it changed and potentially ended her life altogether. But I think when you're talking about suspects, because, again, there's the big ones like Ted Bundy, but there still weren't a lot of killers like this that were picking up a lot of young women and a lot of young women disappearing. There was a good amount of that, again, during the 70s, especially late 70s, there was a lot of that happening more down kind of the Salem, Corvallis, Albany area. That was a little more frequent of a lot of people disappearing, some of whom were hitchhikers, and a lot of these young women disappearing. And, but there wasn't really a whole lot of those working out of the Vancouver, Portland area. And so I think as far as known potential suspects, I think William Leslie Forrest is as close as you really can get to a logistic possible suspect. Does that mean I definitively think he's the guy? No. In fact, I think at best is like a 50-50 chance that he's guilty at all, but I think he's the most logical, considering the time and place And what happened? A young girl suddenly disappearing. Rita Jolly's age, her appearance, all that stuff. I think this guy's about as close as we can contemplate right now in terms of a possible suspect. He didn't live that far away. He wasn't killing others that far away from where Rita Jolly vanished. So, it's a case we can only theorize on, and even in that case, we don't have a whole lot to go on, unfortunately. But I definitely think William Leslie Forrest is a possibility as the killer of Rita Lorraine Jolly, and that's really all we have to go on right now, unfortunately, in this case. And there's going to be other cases I talk about where that's pretty much where we're at, too. We don't know what to take as definitive and what is theoretical speculation, unfortunately, in the disappearance of this 17-year-old girl who just went out for a walk. And that is the story, at least as far as we know so far, of Rita Lorraine Jolly, who vanished from West Linn, Oregon back in the summer of 1973 and has never been seen since. And I want to thank you for watching this video. Again, there's going to be a bunch more videos coming along soon that follow this same dynamic of, missing persons, potentially dead people, John Does, Jane Does, that whole thing. So remember, as always, like, share, subscribe, hit up my Patreon if you want to, and take care of yourself in these times of quarantine, and don't be dumb. It's not just about your life, it's not just about my life, it's about all of our lives in this time, looking out for ourselves and looking out for everyone else around us. And all that said, till next time, this has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.